Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, 12 Common Missteps Resulting from Decentralized HazMat Programs. We're glad you could join us. My name's James. I manage webinars and events here at Triumvirate and will be your moderator for today's event. Before I turn things over to our speaker, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail as we run through a few housekeeping items. This is a refresher for most of you who have attended before. But everyone else, please note that lines are muted on the attendee side. But you can communicate using the questions box over on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can use that to submit questions regarding content of the presentation as well as any technical issues that may come up. Also, following the presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by typing those into the questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. We will save the questions for the end. So again, you can submit them anytime, but we'll use about the last 15 minutes or so to address them. And any unanswered questions will be followed up on after the webinar in the coming days. Also, this webinar presents some of the most common issues that result from DOT HazMat transportation compliance not falling completely under the EH&S umbrella. We'll also talk about an opportunity to attend in-person trainings at the end of the presentation. Finally, you will receive the slide deck and recording of today's event in an email tomorrow. So everything you see today will be sent to you tomorrow. I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Doug Graham. Doug is a senior EH&S consultant and also our external training manager at Triumvirate. He has over 23 years of experience in EH&S training, consulting, auditing, and program development, and has provided over 12,000 hours of training. Doug is a nationally recognized trainer, annual guest instructor at the New England Chapter CHMM Prep Course, and developer of an online HazMat training program. He's also a contributing author of EH&S Journal. And Doug, I will now pass the controls over to you.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This topic sort of developed out of a lot of experience doing environmental health and safety auditing for clients. And one thing that we were seeing on a pretty regular basis was when the topic of hazardous materials transportation compliance came up, we often asked the EH&S people that were participating in the audit whether that falls under their jurisdiction, their responsibilities. And very often what would happen is one of two things. One would be blank stares around the conference room. The other would be the answer being, yes, it does, because we make sure that all of our people that are dealing with waste shipments, hazardous waste and biological waste, have the appropriate DOT hazardous materials training. But then it kind of ends there. And then the discussion turns into, what about the other departments? What about shipping, receiving, hazardous materials management? What about the labs? What about IT? Then we get into who has shipping accounts. Is there an internal gatekeeper screening hazardous materials before they go out? And so as the layers of the onion get peeled back, a lot of times we see that the HazMat program goes far beyond what EH&S typically deals with. And so the whole purpose of this webinar is to talk about the associated problems that are likely to pop up when that's the case, when EH&S really doesn't own this whole program. So again, hazardous materials compliance is kind of has a lot of tentacles that can reach out into different departments and areas within a facility. It can reach anywhere from obviously shipping, receiving, to the environmental people, to materials management. There may be a self-transport going on of deliveries, say from a warehouse to the main facility. So there could be some self-transport issues. There could be labs shipping dry ice. There could be the IT department configuring laptops and then shipping out people out to the field. There could be researchers sending out equipment with lithium batteries. So it really could go everywhere throughout a facility. And again, EH&S typically focuses on this program often only in the waste area, either hazardous or regulated medical waste. So we're going to talk about 12 different common situations that arise from this decentralization of the HazMat program at employers. And rather than me give a short synopsis of all 12, what I'll probably do is just jump into the first one and take it from there. So I'm going to just go through these couple of slides real quick, and we're going to take them one by one. Okay, so the first one is regulatory differences between modes of transport. So, for example, we've got 5 modes of transport and transportation. We've got air, we've got highway, we've got rail, we have marine, and we have the less common pipelines. So one common problem is people not understanding when hazardous materials are going to be flown and when they're going to strictly stay on the ground. That's often not understood, and part of it is just knowing, for example, FedEx policy. So Federal Express, FedEx Express service is an air service, and sometimes employees don't understand that when they're shipping something a short distance, they may think it's going to be staying on the highway, but FedEx Express may fly it to a centralized sorting hub and then fly it back to the local area. And so the FedEx Express service is an air service. And again, that's not necessarily clear to everybody. And of course, when you're dealing with air regulations, specifically with FedEx, you're dealing with a whole different set of requirements from a different set of regulations. So you're into the International Air Transport Association regulations, IATA, versus the 49 CFR that would be used for ground shipments. Okay, as you can see on the slide here, this person's having a revelation that when they shipped dry ice, typically with a ground courier, there were no issues, but when they shipped at FedEx, they had all kinds of problems. And of course, dry ice is one of those materials that's only regulated as hazardous when it's flown. So FedExing dry ice is a lot different than giving it to a ground courier. Okay, so again, this slide reiterates this association between FedEx and the IATA dangerous goods regulations, which is an international set of air rules, internationally based, that FedEx follows also for domestic air shipments as a matter of policy. So obviously, anybody offering hazardous materials to FedEx needs to know that these whole different set of rules apply. Okay, so this just shows a little graphic here on which regulations apply when. There is a third set of rules, the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code. That's the reference there to IMDG. So whether it's going international, domestic, air, ground, water, different rules will apply. Okay, another big issue that we see is that there are a lot of hazardous materials that are not intuitively understood to be hazardous. And one of the big ones, of course, is lithium batteries. And we did, a couple weeks ago, we did a lithium battery webinar, which you could go onto our website and find if you missed that one. That's a very hot topic in hazardous materials transportation, and including enforcement. And these batteries are everywhere nowadays. And there's still not a great understanding that among some employees that these are in fact hazardous material and there are special requirements to get them out the door. So certainly lithium batteries is a big one. Some other common materials that many employees don't realize are hazardous would be genetically modified microorganisms and organisms. So those are regulated by IATA. So if you're going to FedEx those, there are requirements for a proper preparation of those. There are some electronic devices, again with other types of batteries also, might have to be protected from short circuiting, and if they weren't, they would be considered forbidden. There could be equipment with compressed gas chambers, so even air compressed over a certain pressure will be considered a hazardous material. So this can be a real challenge finding all these sort of miscellaneous little articles and substances that, again, are not normally thought of as hazardous material. Okay, so this, again, this slide shows some of the common ones. Magnets is another example. So that's an aircraft issue. If magnets are over a certain field strength or can deflect the compass more than so many degrees from so many feet away, these are considered regulated. You could have instruments that have flammable gas cartridges like flame ionization detectors. So this is the kind of stuff that is definitely worth researching. Okay, another issue is returning materials back to suppliers. So one common response when we talk to clients about the hazardous materials program is they often say our shipping receiving people are not authorized to ship hazardous material. But then the topic of returns comes up, and we talk about, is there a system in place to capture materials that are hazardous coming in that are going to be returned? And again, is there a gatekeeper in shipping receiving saying, wait a minute, let's put the brakes on, that's actually hazardous, so we're not authorized to return it, so we're going to have to stop and come up with a protocol. So very often, if such a protocol is not in place, what will happen is that the shipping receiving personnel will try to mimic how the shipment came in and return it in the same way. And that could open a whole host of problems. One of them is perhaps the shipment came in ground, but they're returning it by air, and the requirements could be quite different. Another one is there are a lot of exceptions in the shipping world. So there could be the shipment came in under either, say, a small quantity or limited quantity or accepted quantity provision, and they may not be able to recognize that. So when they go to return it, thinking it's a non-hazardous material, they're basically declaring something as non-hazardous when it in fact is. So yes, a whole host of problems with returns if that's something not on the radar screen. Okay, the fourth issue that we see is too often the safety data sheet, material safety data sheet, is relied upon as the primary source of information when it comes to shipping procedures. And what happens sometimes is, depending on the quality of the MSDS/SDS, whoever put the sheet together may not have been as proficient about these regulations as they should have. And the screen here, the slide that we see, is actually a real situation that happened at one of our clients, where it was a small manufacturer that had this adhesive that was highly flammable, and the sheet was very clear that it was flammable. It listed a lot of flammable solvent ingredients, but yet when you go to the transportation section of their MSDS, lo and behold, it said it was a non-regulated material. So that's kind of an egregious mistake, and the errors that sometimes show up on the sheets are not as egregious as that often, but unless there's some kind of QCing of the information on the MSDS, these problems can pop up. Shipping names being incorrect is another fairly common problem, and it has a lot to do with the overall quality of the sheet, the resources of the company that prepared it, and so you do find a lot of variability. So, and also that's a section of the safety data sheet that's actually optional. So it may just have a disclaimer, such as follow all local, national, and international shipping regulations, or some such statement. So the people preparing hazardous materials really need to be able to develop their own shipping protocol really from scratch, and not relying on a third party giving them the protocol. Again, EH&S may not have this under their umbrella, because maybe this is more the shipping department, materials management issues, but obviously if something happens, sometimes, as we know, EH&S people, it ends up plopping on our desks anyway. So this should another thing to be on the radar screen. Okay, so to be able to do this from scratch, the people really have to be pretty well trained in order to look at the properties of the material, classify the material in accordance with the definitions in the shipping regulations, and then move on to assignment of packing group, assignment of shipping name, and then going through the regulations to come up with the protocol. So again, shortcuts are nice, but they have their own set of downfalls potentially. Okay, another issue, not controlling access to shipping accounts only to trained individuals. So this is especially problematic when facilities are large. There are lots of departments, there are lots of individual department heads, and there's not necessarily one controlling authority over a lot of issues. So for example, universities, this is an especially challenging issue when you've got 25 buildings and 20 department heads and 35 FedEx accounts, and so trying to capture everybody that could be potentially offering a hazardous material to a UPS or a FedEx can be a huge challenge. And so what really needs to happen is there needs to be a system in place where awareness training is given to anybody who's potentially able to ship something. And then there's a gatekeeper that these shipments have to be processed through before they go out the door. Someone who can screen them and ask the right questions about whether it's a hazardous material or not. So, and of course, when we start asking questions like, is this hazardous, or is it flammable, it's easy to get on, no, it should be fine, because what they often know is that if they say yes, there's going to be a lot more questions and it's not going to get out by 4 o'clock. So this is always a challenge, again, without a gatekeeper internally. Okay, so having this unrestricted access to the shipping accounts, having all kinds of different UPS and FedEx accounts, this is definitely a vulnerability. Okay, number 6, inadvertently creating inspection and enforcement triggers. I kind of like this slide. Try to put a little humor into this one. So one of the big issues is not understanding the difference from an enforcement standpoint between highway shipments and air shipments. So the enforcement is much more rigorous in the air shipping world. There's a lot more screening that goes on. There are hazardous materials specialists with checklists and clipboards eager to reject improperly prepared shipments. There's the Federal Aviation Administration that has a presence at the terminals looking for incorrectly prepared shipments. There are random inspections performed by the FAA based on simply pulling shipping papers. So these are all things that can be avoided if the shipment can go by ground. Okay, and sometimes it's just a question of not realizing how much more a facility is on the radar screen when it does ship by air. And the penalties are also a lot higher as well. Okay. So now, if an air shipment does have to be made, there are also exceptions that could be used that would avoid the preparation of a dangerous goods declaration, such as the accepted quantities provision in the IATA regulations that are discussed on this slide. Obviously, there are parameters, requirements to be followed. These are small quantity shipments, but if this is not investigated, it's possible that this exception could be used and nobody realizes it, and a declaration is being needlessly created, and therefore a potential inspection trigger is also being created inadvertently. Okay, number 7, shipping by air when it's not necessary to ship by air. So this is really dovetailing off the last topic. Again, maybe it's just an overzealousness to get something out the door quickly when it's not necessary to get it out the door that quickly. So choosing an air service over a ground service, you know, to my way of thinking, if one of the first questions I'm going to ask if a customer says they need it tomorrow, I'm going to say, how about in a couple of days? Because if we can, again, go ground versus air, we're really cutting down our liability quite a bit. Potential penalties, the level of scrutiny the shipment's going to get is night and day. So there we go. Ship by ground if you can. Avoid air whenever possible. Okay, self-transport. It's surprising sometimes how often the EH&S department doesn't realize that their employer is actually moving hazardous materials around by themselves, either with company vehicles, personal vehicles, hiring couriers, and all of these activities are really not on the radar screen of the EH&S department. Does some attempt at humor on that one. Okay, so we don't want to have an incident like we see on the screen here. So the materials of trade rule is a big advantage in the DOT regulations for self-transport. It really does cut the regulatory burden down quite a bit. So if employees are self-transporting materials for the employer's own use, such as moving things from a warehouse to the main facility and that kind of thing with company vehicles, if the quantities are fairly small, if the categories of material are not highly dangerous, this material of trade exception is a very powerful tool. It's also possible to self-transport fully regulated materials not using this exception, but it will involve a lot of training for those employees, and the employer becomes both the shipper and the carrier, and so there's a lot of associated compliance issues, including creating a shipping paper and following all the carrier requirements. So and potentially commercial driver's licensing, placarding a vehicle. So it becomes a big program. So knowing whether there's some self-transport going on is a hugely important issue. Personal vehicles, there's nothing that specifically disallows the use of a personal vehicle for self-transport of a hazardous material by an employer. However, you do bump up against some insurance and liability issues, so it's something that should definitely be looked at and scrutinized, and probably a bad idea. Okay, getting back to that last slide, the materials of trade exception also cannot be used if a third party is hired. So if, say, for example, a courier service, local courier service is hired, then that's very similar to hiring any other commercial transporter, say a UPS or a FedEx. Those materials are going to be fully regulated, and you won't be able to take advantage of the material trade rule. Okay, number 9, not obtaining the correct software pre-approval or contract. There are some hazardous materials and some carriers that cannot be offered unless pre-approval is granted by the operator, by the carrier. So here's a couple examples on the screen. FedEx Express, if hazardous materials are going to be offered and a dangerous goods declaration is going to need to be generated for that shipment, starting about 3 years ago, FedEx implemented a variation where their error checking software or a third-party error checking software approved by FedEx has to be used in order to generate those forms. Okay, and so just merely populating a PDF of a dangerous goods declaration is no longer allowed by FedEx. So again, this might not be on everybody's radar screen. FedEx and UPS both have pre-approval programs for shipping certain types of lithium batteries, specifically the non-rechargeable primary lithium metal batteries. And that's when they're being shipped alone, not with or installed in equipment. Okay, and also UPS requires a hazardous materials contract in order to be set up to ship hazardous materials with them. And there are some exceptions to that. So really the UPS website is the key to understanding when and when not that contract's required. Okay, number 10. This is a huge one, not determining the competency of the employees that are tasked with preparing shipments. So again, an environmental health and safety department is generally well plugged into the waste world. So employees signing off on hazardous waste shipments or regulated medical waste shipments, they're on their radar screen and they're generally trained in accordance with the regulations. Other employees, it's kind of hit or miss as to whether the EH&S department has any oversight with them. Okay, so there's a big difference between a trained employee and a qualified and competent employee. And one of the main reasons for that in this world, this hazardous material shipping world, is the complexity and the volume of the regulations. And it really is, training is something that should almost be looked at as a first step in a process of the employee becoming qualified and competent. And this is something that's not crystal clear in the regulations themselves. They're pretty clear on what the training requirements are, and there's a lot of flexibility in terms of time and content. But there's nothing that, it's implied, but there's nothing that specifically talks about employers ensuring the competency of their employees. So employers really need to think hard about what are their employees really capable of doing, how well do they understand the regulations, what kind of training did they go through, how often did they go through it, how experienced are they. If you have somebody new, like the gentleman we see on our screen here, that's gone through their first hazardous materials training class, it's a very unrealistic expectation that they can be then cut loose to come up with shipping protocols for hazardous materials mistake-free. So it's a process, and there really should be a program where the employer has a way to gauge competency. Okay, so in an ideal world, the employee would go to a training session, either ground or air or both. They would then come back and work sort of as an apprentice to a more experienced employee that's very qualified, been doing this for a long time, get their feet wet, and then at some point the employer maybe do some kind of competency evaluation. Maybe it's a hands-on type of exam where they're tasked with coming up with a shipping protocol, demonstrating all the steps that are required. So this is one interesting side note, is that the IHMM has actually developed a new certification for hazardous materials shippers. It's the Certified Dangerous Goods Professional, the CDGP, which is interesting because it's the first competency-based certification for anything related to this hazmat shipping world. So that's something worth investigating if you're an employer, particularly if you're looking to hire someone from the outside to come in and maybe hit the road running as a hazardous materials shipper. Okay, number 11, not training receivers. Okay, so receivers are actually, can be an important link, especially in the emergency response realm, as well as rejecting shipments that are leaking or damaged. There's really a hazard communication component when it comes to receivers, and there's letters of interpretation from the Department of Transportation that make it clear that someone who's receiving hazardous material is in fact a hazmat employee as subject to training. So some of the scenarios, for example, with receivers, is there could be a driver that's trying to drop off a salvage container that has a leaking or damaged hazardous material on the inside. Now, if they haven't been trained to understand what a salvage container is really all about, which is something that contains a damaged hazardous material shipment during transport, they might not be as inclined to reject that shipment, and if they don't have that context. Another issue is there's a lot of cryptic markings in the DOT hazmat shipping world that are not intuitive, such as the limited quantity marking, which is simply a 4-inch white diamond that's black on the top and bottom with no text. There's also retail products that are hazardous that are shipped as ORMD, consumer commodities, so there's a sticker that will state that, but again, out of context, they may not realize that that's a hazardous material. So there's always that danger in inappropriate response to leaking or damaged containers because of the lack of understanding of the markings. And like we talked about before, attempting to return hazardous material shipments without realizing they're hazardous. The slide you're looking at is a little bit facetious. The limited quantity shouldn't create that drastic a problem since it is a lower risk type of shipment, but I just couldn't resist putting that on the slide. Okay, so yes, like I said, hazmat employees is the term used by the DOT basically to describe an employee who's subject to the hazardous materials training because they perform some sort of task related to either preparing materials for shipment or driving them over the road or receiving them. Okay, so this slide reiterates those common issues related to receivers. Okay, number 12's got a bunch of stuff in it, so we're going to drill down a little bit on each of these. But if there is a decentralized hazardous materials program, then it's almost certain that there's not going to be any centralized responsibilities for the administrative requirements. So the big ones are annual registration, also security planning, and there's also a lot of record keeping related to this program, such as past shipping papers. So we'll take these one at a time. The hazmat registration program was actually dates back to 1993 when it began, and it's really a way of collecting revenue from shippers and carriers of hazardous material to fund the DOT's hazardous materials program. This actually is something that can be done corporate-wide for multiple facilities, but it's something that is based upon the quantities and also the types of hazardous material that are being offered. Okay, so there are 6 triggers, 6 different types of shipments that if they take place at any one time during the course of the year, would require the shipper or the carrier to file a registration and pay the associated annual fee. Okay, the fee structure is based on small businesses and nonprofits versus non-small businesses. So there's a different fee schedule for each. And if this is discovered where the employer was supposed to register for previous years but failed to, the expectation of the DOT is that the employer will retroactively register for each year they missed and pay the associated fee that was in effect that year. So the form that's filed has not changed over the years. So again, retroactive filing after discovery of this discrepancy is something that we see quite a bit. Okay, sometimes an individual facility doesn't know whether this has been done or not. So sometimes it's a call to the corporate office and to see if maybe there's someone in corporate EH&S that actually does this without the knowledge of the individual facilities. If that's the case, then there should be a copy of the annual registration certificate that's at each site covered under that registration, because proof of registration is something that should be at each site. Okay, so that, again, that's a common one that slips through the cracks. One of the most common trigger for this is a placardable quantity. So if the amount and type of hazardous material offered at any one time requires the driver to placard the vehicle for that shipment, that's a trigger that would require the facility that's offering it to register for that year. And it's a July 1st to June 30th registration year. The expectation being that the facility would register before they made that shipment. Okay, some other administrative issues besides the annual registration. Security planning is a big one. So that program goes back to 2003 in the wake of 9/11 and the genesis of the Homeland Security Department. So DOT was approached by Homeland Security to develop an anti-terrorism rule for hazardous materials transportation. And so in 2003, this rule came out. Similar to the registration program, it's based on triggers. Okay, so under the security planning rule, there are 16 different categories of shipments that, if made at any one time, would require a security plan to be developed and implemented at the site. This is also applicable to transporters. So this is often an evaluation of past shipments to see if there are any of these triggering categories and if they're going to happen in the future. Okay, now the security plan is site-specific, but it can cover a lot of different departments. Very often it's based on hazardous waste shipments, but not always. So it could also be a combination of waste shipments that may have triggered this requirement, or it could be virgin material chemical shipments that may have done it. Or radioactives could also have been the trigger. Okay, record keeping, the big issues there are copies of the registration statement, the annual registration statement, past shipping papers. So there could be shipping papers being generated from multiple departments, and the question is, who is responsible for making sure there's at least 2 years worth of all hazardous materials shipping papers, whether those are dangerous goods declarations, bills of lading, FedEx ground, Form OP, whatever the case may be, any hazardous material shipping papers. Also, is there a centralized program for dealing with regulatory inspections? So, for example, if the Federal Aviation Administration, which is the most likely candidate, knocks on the door, who are they going to ask for? Well, they certainly will ask for the person that signed the dangerous goods declaration, but they also might want to talk to someone who is in a position of authority over the person that signed that, and invariably, environmental health and safety gets kind of drawn into this world if there's a regulatory inspection related to anything hazardous. So better to think about it ahead of time rather than get a surprise inspection from FAA and not really know who should be dealing with that, who should be the point of contact there. Special permits is another one. So there are documents that allow certain types of shipments to be prepared and transported in a way that varies from the regulatory requirements. So it's good to know whether any shipments going out are being prepared under a special permit. And sometimes those special permits are related to waste transporters, and again, EH&S might not realize that these permits exist, and there are some compliance responsibilities that are described in the permits themselves. So hopefully this gives everybody a little bit of an overview and if you're in the EH&S world, as to the types of things that could be, types of problems that could be generated by you really not owning this whole program. Okay, James, did you want to chime in with to discuss questions or?
Yes, thanks, Doug. And we'll move on to that final slide. We've got a couple questions that have come in so far, and I will open up the floor to questions at this time. We'll keep Doug busy for the remainder of the webinar. And before we get to those, I just want to remind you that you will receive the presentation today. I know some people signed on a little late and might have missed that note, but we'll send you this presentation and the recording tomorrow morning. In addition, you'll receive a survey. We'd appreciate your feedback on the webinar, any ideas for improvement. Let us know what you thought. We take it pretty seriously, and as many of you know, are running these on a regular basis at this point. So stay in touch with your thoughts. Also, as I mentioned earlier, Triumvirate offers open enrollment trainings, primarily in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, but I know Doug also travels from time to time to certain organizations. So what I'm going to do right now is send over a link to our training page, and I welcome you to take a look at what we're offering. Some that come to mind within the next couple of months. We're in Rhode Island. Doug is in Massachusetts, Maine. We've got some in Baltimore. So feel free to sign up for those. Most of them revolve around DOT hazardous materials, as well as RCRA trainings and lithium batteries too. So take a look at that. In addition to open enrollment trainings, Triumvirate provides hazardous waste disposal, consulting, among other EHS services. So feel free to give us a call. We've got our phone number there and our website for you to look up some more information. I've also included Doug's email address. I know he loves questions, so if you don't have any today, digest this content and reach out within the coming days. I'm sure he'll be happy to respond. So that's it for my quick commercial. We'll get to those questions that have come through and use up the remainder of this time. We might be able to wrap up before 3 o'clock. So Doug, to start, just to set the foundation here, I know you selected 12 missteps. I'm sure this list can be expanded, but for the sake of time, you focused on 12 of the most common mistakes that can result from a decentralized environment. Can you talk about, are these weighted in any particular way? What's the most common mistake you see with clients, and are there any tips for centralizing these responsibilities?
Well, that's a good question. The reason we picked these 12 is that they actually all come up. To be honest with you, I would say if you wanted to rank them in terms of seriousness, I would think that anything that could result in an inspection, that could cause an inspection trigger from the FAA, is probably going to be something that should be of the biggest concern to an employer, because that really is the place where you find the biggest penalties. So whether it's making sure people understand what shipments have to be prepared in accordance with the air regulations, and also making sure that anybody that is preparing an air shipment is very qualified to do it, very competent, very comfortable with reading and understanding the regulations and developing these procedures, is very paramount. So I put the emphasis on anything related to air.
Right. And so the second part of that question, which came in, is where do we start from here? I guess it depends on the organization, but where do you recommend an attendee begin after viewing this webinar in terms of, okay, we're making a few of these mistakes today. How do you recommend kind of bringing the team together and actually affecting some change and taking action? Any tips there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if it were me, I think step number one would be to do a survey of the facility, asking all the different departments to chime in on whether they're currently or potentially in the future going to be offering anything that's hazardous for shipment. And I would definitely include in that survey a list of the common things that would be suspected. High on that list, I think, would be dry ice, lithium batteries, battery-powered devices, genetically modified microorganisms, And then obviously the common things such as flammables and corrosives and the usual suspects. And I think once you get those survey results back, then that'll be really step one, because you'll have an idea of who the hazmat employees are. I think the second step would be to come up with a training program to make sure the right people get trained. And then I think also along with that is to try to centralize your shipping program so there is an internal gatekeeper that can be assisting and also screening anything that's potentially going out the door.
Who should that gatekeeper be? Who makes the best gatekeeper in your experience?
Somebody well experienced and trained in this hazardous material shipping world.
Right.
So they could come out of the shipping department, they could come out of EH&S, and it could be that maybe there isn't a good gatekeeper yet too. That's also possible.
Right, and so just a couple left here. We'll start to wrap things up. But as far as resources go, in terms of developing this training program, can you offer any insight there or recommendations as far as getting trained, but also developing your own training program?
There's obviously good training companies around the country. The big names are good. What I think I would avoid is most of the online resources, to be honest, because this is a pretty complicated world, a regulatory world. So I would definitely go with training providers that have solid reputations, longer courses, more detailed courses, and as far as developing the training programs internally, I think one thing that you'll probably find is that it's going to take even longer for someone to develop the expertise to be able to come and do their own training internally. So it could be a longer process of using outside resources.
Right, and do you find it best to bring a small group to these trainings, if possible?
Yeah, getting back to the qualified and competent issue, sending one person off and putting the burden on that one person to try to be the go-to person is it could be very difficult. So I think I would try to have a team of people that are dedicated to this whole topic, where they can bounce ideas and help out each other. So rather than the lone wolf approach.
Great advice. And for our final question, this is also from Doug. If an air shipment is prepared based on the DOT requirements, does it also have to meet the IATA requirements? Does DOT have jurisdiction over IATA?
That's a great question. IATA is actually a private organization, a trade association made up of member airlines and countries. And so it's really, you're following the IATA regulations by the policy of who you're offering it to. So, for example, FedEx, they're obviously one of the biggest. FedEx Express shipments, FedEx by policy follows IATA. Okay, so to prepare a shipment just in accordance with the 49 CFR DOT regulations would not be compliant because the IATA regulations go further, and they're a little bit different. Okay, so that shipment would be rejected if it was prepared in accordance with the DOT air regulations. Now, the only real exception to that is UPS domestic air shipments. Those are really the only air shipments that could be prepared in accordance with just the DOT requirements. However, be aware that UPS has a lot of their own restrictions, and so you would have to couple that with the UPS hazardous materials shipping guide as well. So, long answer, but the short of it is anybody that's doing air shipments, other than UPS domestic air, really has to have both the DOT training and the IATA training and make sure that it's prepared in accordance with the IATA regulations, or else it's coming back.
All right, it's a thorough answer. Thank you, Doug. And we'll just wrap up right there. That was our last question. Doug, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us today. I hope everybody's able to take away some lessons and hopefully avoid some of these mistakes that Doug covered in the presentation. And so we'll wrap it up there. Look for that email tomorrow morning with additional resources, and we hope to see you on one of our upcoming webinars or in one of Doug's trainings. So thank you for your participation. Great questions, and we appreciate you joining today. Thanks a lot. Doug, anything to close?
No, just thank you everybody for participating, and thanks James for moderating.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone. Have a good one.